they're not permitted to engage in sexual relations. And if they do, then they can, go to jail or have any number of things happen to them. But a number of them were raped, and some of them had sexual encounters.
That insight really challenges the assumptions most people carry.
People assume women in the sex industry are trafficked, and they're like, no, we weren't. And this was for them, a difficult choice, necessarily. A very difficult choice. But it wasn't like someone kidnapped them. And they would say, well, Pardis, I'm making more money doing this.
You've been a dean, provost, university president. At that level, the stakes are huge.
When they think of human trafficking, they think of women in the sex industry. And they don't realize that how many men are being trafficked into things like construction.
You have written about how trafficking and terror get used as political tools. What made you realize those narratives weren't matching what you were seeing on the ground?
He said, Pardis, people can take everything from you. They can take your belongings, they can take your home, they can even take your country. But the one thing no one can ever take from you is your education. They can never take your mind.
People think resistance always looks loud. You show how it can look like pleasure, intimacy, joy.
I've always wanted to help people own their narrative because it was also my way of finding my voice, and it was my way of owning my narrative. I think I always identified with people who had something to say and really wanted to be listened to.
You have written 8 books. Which one changed you the most while writing it, and why?
When most Americans in the United States think about Iran, they only think about mullahs and oil. But there's this robust, brilliant, vibrant youth movement, and they had a lot to say, and they disagreed with the regime, and no one was hearing them.
When you hear the word freedom today, after everything you've seen, what does it mean to you now?
I think, honestly, the women of Iran, it was every day, every single day that they went out there with the hijab sliding back, with the red lipstick and the red nail polish. That's every day, even after Neda, the Green Movement, even after Mahsa, even after all these things, there they were, still out there on the front lines protesting, even though their lives were at stake. That's a daily. It's just an incredible expression of courage.
That says so much about the gap between the narrative and the reality.
It's nothing if I don't get my own inner state right. And I had to realize that. I had to come to that my greatest contribution in this world is my own inner state and how I can help others come to a better, more beautiful inner state.
Welcome back. Today on Beyond the Summit, you're going to meet someone whose life reads like a map of borders, crossed, questioned, and redefined. Dr. Pardis Mahdavi has spent years inside worlds most people never see, from underground youth culture in Iran to migrant labor camps in Dubai, to the highest levels of American universities. She's followed the stories that hide behind headlines, politics, and silence. She's an anthropologist, a storyteller, a university leader, and the author of 8 powerful books that change the way we think about identity, gender, freedom, and what it means to live between cultures. What sets her apart isn't just her expertise, it's her courage to look where others don't. She doesn't study people from distance. She sits with them, she listens, she brings dignity back into stories that weren't stripped of it. And today we are going deeper than any bio can capture. We are talking about the moments that changed her, the failure no one sees, the pressure of leading major institution, and the truth about migration and human resilience, and how her definition of freedom has transformed over time. If you've ever felt caught between identities, if you've ever questioned your place in the world, or if you're simply hungry for wisdom from someone who has lived life on multiple front lines, this episode will stay with you. Dr. Mahdavi, it's an absolute honor to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute honor to be here. And please call me Pardis. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to speak with you today.
Fantastic. So, Pardis, I love to begin with your early years. When you look back at your early years, your family, Iran, migration, what moment shaped you the way you see the world today?
I think all of it. I describe myself as a child of the revolution. My parents came here during the Iranian Revolution. So I think that sets into motion, right? The moment your soul chooses to enter the world, My soul, I guess, chose to enter the world at a moment of great transition and at a moment of revolution and resistance. So I think, growing up, as Iranian American in the United States, growing up in Minnesota, that what you described, feeling caught between worlds, very much resonates with me. The fact that, growing up, I would watch on television images, I would see images of Iranians burning American flags, same time as I would see and hear American leaders referring to Iran as axis of evil. You know, my two home countries constantly at war, calling one another the great Satan. What does that mean for people who are Iran and America in one body? If you have two countries and cultures at war, what does that mean? I think it means that you grow up constantly wanting to be a bridge, constantly wanting to bridge worlds, and constantly wanting to translate one to the other.
I appreciate you sharing that. Hearing that part of your story really connects the dots in such a meaningful way. You have built your life between cultures, as you mentioned. When did you first realize that you were navigating the world as hyphenated person?
I think I realized that very early on. When I was very young, before we moved to California, we were in Minnesota. And I remember I would go to school with a lunchbox full of korma sabzi, a very popular Iranian dish. It's very aromatic stew. And I would open my lunchbox, and the kids were like, "What is that stinky thing?" And I was like, "What do you mean? That's like my favorite dish." And it made me painfully aware that I was different. I was very aware that I was different. And so I think probably from the age of 5.
That's so relatable. And the way you described it makes it in between space feel so human. So how did that shape your confidence or your sense of belonging growing up?
I think growing up, I was always worried about what was coming around the corner. My parents, there was always one bag packed in the corner of the room, like, okay, we're going back to Iran. The revolution's going to be done, and everything's going to be okay. It's going to go back to the way it was, and then we're going to go home. My parents were always like, we're going to go home. And I'm like, what do you mean? Isn't this home? This is all I've ever known. This is home. And so this sense of something's going to happen, or you always have to be ready to go, that was heightened for me because at the age of 6, we moved from Minnesota to California. I came home from school one day. There was a sign on the front door. It said, "Burn this house, terrorists live here." Of course, we're not, my father's a physician, and and they said, okay, it's time for us to leave. At the time, Minnesota was not as welcoming as it is today. And we decided to move to California. My mom was very keen to move to Tehran or Los Angeles, but my father, having grown up near the Caspian Sea, actually preferred San Diego, which in 1984 was a very sleepy water town. And so we moved there so we could be close to Tehran, but not in it. But, my father, he said something to me in that move that was really important to my trajectory. He said, Pardis, people can take everything from you. They can take your belongings, they can take your home, they can even take your country. But the one thing no one can ever take from you is your education. They can never take your mind. And so even though I felt things were disrupted again in 1984, we moved to California. I didn't know anybody. Once again, everything is up in turmoil. My father saying that to me made me realize, oh, my job is school. My job is to do really well in school. And so that's where I tried to find belonging, was kind of in and through the education system. And then many, many years later, that's what motivated me to want to be a leader in education.
Was there ever a moment where you felt the cost of that identity, feeling too much of something or not enough of something?
Throughout my life, yes. I think even still, I think that's something we wrestle. Many people like me, I wrestle with both of those things still. Those are Jung calls it your shadow. I wrestle with feeling too much and not enough all the time. But that's the shadow work I get to do now. I think when I was growing up, I felt both of those things very acutely. I felt that I was so much, and yet not enough for let's say, my host society, which was, the United States.
I love how openly you talk about that. A lot of people watching will feel seen in what you just said. You've spent years researching people whose voices rarely reach the surface: migrant workers, women in the Persian Gulf region, youth in Iran. What pulled you toward their stories?
I think I've always wanted to help people amplify their voice. And I think I've always wanted to help people own their narrative because it was also my way of finding my voice and it was my way of owning my narrative. I think I always identified with people who had something to say and really wanted to be listened to. And really the world needs to hear from them. You know, if you think about youth movements in Iran, when we think about Iran, you know, when most Americans in the United States think about Iran, they only think about mullahs and oil, you know, the average, right? But there's this robust, brilliant, vibrant youth movement, and they had a lot to say, and they disagreed with the regime, and no one was hearing them. And it's important that the world understand that they're there, that they're telling a different story, because that is part of the larger story. And so, you know, I think I've always resonated with people who have something to say, but are just wanting a little bit of help being heard.
That's powerful. And it says a lot about the kind of human being you are. So when you were in the field, what moment changed you permanently?
Many
I bet
moments,
you
I
had a
think.
lot of moments.
I had a lot of moments. Actually, I think it was, for me, it was early in my field work. It was in the year 2000. I'd say, you know, each of my field sites has had one of those defining moments. But in 2000, I remember I was in Iran and I was going to a party, of course, a party, you know, which is, you know, technically, you know, legal to have women and men socializing, alcohol, which is technically not legal. But I was on my way to this party and, you know, going to the house and everyone's taking off their layers. And, you know, somebody said something to me and they said, you know, Pardis, in America, when you want to, you know, party and whatever, you go out and when you want to kind of work through things, you go out. But when you want to pray and be spiritual, you stay in. In America, in Iran, excuse me, when we want to party, we go inside, we stay in. But when we want to pray and be spiritual, we do it as performance on the street. And I thought, "Oh, that's so fascinating." And then, you know, I think just meeting young people who were willing to literally risk their bodies for their message to be heard. I mean, you know, there was that book, Lipstick Jihad. And of course, you know, the book, whatever you want to think about the book, you know, I think that framework of people willing to risk everything to have a say over their own bodies, to have a say, do I get to wear red lipstick? Do I get to wear red nail polish? The fact that they're willing, you know, because these were things that were punishable, you know, by all manner of things. People could, you know, if you just going to a party and having a drink in the presence of somebody of the opposite sex could get you thrown in jail. Therefore, that is an act of defiance. The fact that people were doing that night after night after night and trying to push the envelope, and you know, women were sliding the hijab back further and further and further. People called it the millimeter revolution. They were willing to risk everything for what they believed, and that changed me completely. Being in that environment completely changed how I saw the world.
Thank you so much for sharing that, so it's so powerful and touching. So let's talk about one of your books. Your book, Gridlock, reveals the hidden world behind Dubai's glamour. What's one truth about migration in the Persian Gulf region that most of the world still misunderstand?
I think most of the world, when they think of human trafficking, they think of women in the sex industry. And they don't realize that how many men are being trafficked into things like construction. So when I first became interested in the subject, it was one of my early trips to Dubai in 2004. Interestingly, I had gone to Dubai. I had followed a group of Iranian sex workers who told me they would go to Dubai for, let's say, you know, a month at a time, make more money in 1 month than I ever have in 1 year. And then they would come back and feed their families. And I was fascinated by this. And then, so I was like, tell me more. People assume women in the sex industry are trafficked. And they're like, no, we weren't. And this was for them, you know, a difficult choice necessarily. very difficult choice. But they wasn't like someone kidnapped them, and they would say, making more money doing this. I don't want to work at, scrubbing toilets. I can make more money and feed my family. And I was interested, this is a different way of thinking about things. But when I got to Dubai, what I was really struck by is seeing hundreds, if not thousands of men actually in chains building these buildings so quickly. There was this at the time, 2004, build the building. And men were working, 36-hour shifts, not getting paid. So I started interviewing these men. And, when you go back to the definition of trafficking, which is force, fraud, or coercion, many of these men were frauded, if not coerced, meaning they were brought to, from oftentimes India or Africa. They were brought to Dubai to work in the construction industry. They were not told that they were going to work 36-hour shifts in the heat. They were not told they were going to live in a labor camp. They were told they were going to make a certain amount of money. Many of them told me that their wages were being withheld by unscrupulous middlemen who said, well, you still owe us for the journey. And I thought, this is the classic definition of trafficking. But of course, in 2004, if you came, I went back, I was in Washington, D.C. at a couple of conferences, and I said, there are men being trafficked in Dubai. People laughed at me. They're like, men aren't trafficked. Now, of course, now we know they are, 21 years later. But at the time, and I still think the average person, when you talk to the average person about Dubai, they talk to you about yachts and glamour and champagne and this and that and the other. And they talk about, I stayed in this hotel in this fancy place and this and this and this. And they don't think about how do those hotels get built, and what is the shadow economy on which that entire ecosystem is resting.
That insight really challenges the assumptions most people carry. It's eye-opening. When you were living and researching in the Persian Gulf region, what moment challenged you emotionally the most?
I think there were many moments. There was a time when I had just had my second child, and he was still nursing. He was only 1 year old, and we were there doing field work. And I had come to learn of the labor laws that contractually sterilized women, meaning that there were laws on the books that said women, when they're, on contract working as, let's say, domestic workers or what have you in Dubai or what have you, they're not permitted to engage in sexual relations. And if they do, then they can, go to jail or have any number of things happen to them. But a number of them were raped, and some of them had sexual encounters. And when they were seen to be pregnant, or when they went to help with their pregnancy, they were put in jail. And then they would have the baby, and the baby was taken away from them, oftentimes if they had to be deported, because the baby was stateless, right? Citizenship in many countries passes through the father, and Dubai does not have birthright citizenship. And so, the father wasn't coming forward and saying, hi, I raped my maid or whoever. So the babies were stateless, and the moms were deported. And sometimes they were held in jail for a while. Sometimes there was a trial, sometimes there wasn't. But I remember I was doing a visit in one of the jails, and there were a group of women, and they had their babies, and they were nursing, and I was nursing my son. And they shared that pretty soon their babies would be taken from them and they would be sent home. And I mean, it just seemed unimaginable to me.
That says so much about the gap between the narrative and the reality. Thank you for bringing that forward. You have written about how trafficking and terror get used as political tools. What made you realize those narratives weren't matching what you were seeing on the ground?
I think that it became very apparent to me when I would try to introduce the conversation that men were being trafficked. And there was this desire to constantly focus on women who were being trafficked and as these victims. And it was seen the men were the villains, right? It was the men are the villains. They're trafficking women. They're doing horrible things. And all of that was part of a justification for the war on terror. This is, if you think about post 9/11 and you think about Afghanistan, you think about the whole region, there was a very, very powerful, large narrative that said, men are villains. We have to go after them. We have to go after them. And, it seemed that the hyper feminized trafficking rhetoric was the antidote to the hyper-masculine terrorism rhetoric when it came to the Middle East. And that was creating a really problematic narrative because, of course, I am the daughter of a Middle Eastern man. I am the sister of two Middle Eastern men. I am the mother of two young Middle Eastern American boys. So, you know, I was like, what? That doesn't sound right to me. And it also, the complexity of the role of capitalism in trafficking seemed to be eclipsed by this simplified narrative. And so to me, it seemed a moment to intervene.
That completely reframes how we think about these issues. It's such an important distinction. In your view, what's the difference between saving people and listening to people?
I think listening to people is really about making sure that they have agency. Your question comes down to a question of agency. I think the first question is always to listen. The first step is to say, what do you want? And if they say, hey, I'd like some help getting out of this situation, then by all means, let's do that. I think the challenge comes when it's assumed that somebody needs help in a certain way, and that's not the way that they need help. I'll give you another example. I remember hearing, a story, just after 9/11, and the war on terror was going on in Afghanistan. I remember I was working with some Afghan women, and they shared with me that at one point, there was American helicopters came and they were dropping bags, and these women thought, oh, they're dropping food, and so everybody ran out. They thought, oh, it's food for my kids, and come to find out that at the time, the First Lady Laura Bush had engaged in a partnership with Estee Lauder. The packages were opened. It was makeup inside. And these women were like, what? And so, that question of like, maybe ask what we need before you assume what we need. Um,
That's such a grounding perspective. You can feel the respect in the way you approach these stories. How has that shaped the way you tell the stories in your books?
I think I've always been driven by a desire to help people find their voices and help amplify their voices. And so for me, it's been important to as I'm writing, to check with people. Does this sound right to you? Does this feel right to you? That's always been really important to me. And then, when you shift later on to my life as a university leader, very determined that students feel heard. I was always very determined. And so I think I erred on the side of like over checking, asking them, does this policy feel right to you? Does this sound right to you? Does it feel right to you? Potentially because that's something I always felt misunderstood, I think, growing up. I felt like people weren't hearing me, they weren't listening to me. And so I feel that probably I try really, really hard to listen.
So, one of your books, Passionate Uprising, opened a window into youth culture and private life in Iran. What surprised you the most in that journey?
I think the risks people were willing to take to get their message across, I think that was really, really surprising to me. Also, I think, for me, personally, I had this maybe romanticized notion that I would go to Iran and I would fit and I would belong and I would feel so good. And I got to Iran and I'm like, oh God, I don't belong here either. Like my accent, of course, Farsi is my first language, but I would
Over the
speak and
years?
they would say, Lahja, mani dari, had any kind of, have an accent, or, my hijab was constantly falling off. It was constantly slipping. I just am very discombobulated a lot of the time. And I remember that being a bit of a surprise. Like, oh, I thought I was going to get to Iran and everything was going to make sense. And I got to Iran and I was completely drawn in by the youth movement, but I certainly didn't feel like I belonged.
So that gives such a real picture of what life looks like beneath the surface. People think resistance always looks loud. You show how it can look like pleasure, intimacy, joy. Why do you think the world struggles to understand that?
That's such a good question, Amir. I think we have placed a lot, people say intimacy is overdetermined. I think we've become a little bit addicted to suffering. And so we think resistance equals suffering. And I think we forget to recognize the joy that comes in resistance. And I think because so many of us are caught in a suffering state, course, you see the world, you see your external world based on your inner state. So if your inner state is suffering, you're always going to see suffering in your external world. But I think things are shifting in the last 5 or 10 years.
That flips the whole narrative of what resistance looks like.
Yeah, exactly.
Such a refreshing angle. Thank you.
Thank
When you
you.
look at Iran's youth today, 2025, what gives you the most hope?
My goodness, they've been so successful. Not just so it's interesting, right? You have people who are my age, our age, we would say children of the revolution. And then you have our kids, a lot of us call them children of the resistance. They were born to people like in our generation who were already resistors. They were born to the resistors. And so, when the Women Life Freedom Zan Zindagi Azadi movement was happening, the most refreshing part was watching 15-year-old girls stand up and fight. And I was like, gosh, that's success. Even if the rest of the world is like, well, but the mullahs are still there and nothing has changed. I'm like, that's success. That's intergenerational resistance right there. And how many times and in how many contexts do you hear the word intergenerational with something positive after? Usually you hear intergenerational poverty, intergenerational trauma. The Iranians demonstrated intergenerational strength and intergenerational resistance. How can you not celebrate that as a success?
That's a beautiful reflection. You can hear how much hope and respect you have for this generation. You've been a dean, provost, university president. At that level, the stakes are huge. What was the hardest part of stepping into those roles?
I think I felt that the hardest part of stepping into those roles is I felt like I wasn't doing enough for the students. Later, I realized that the system, higher ed system, currently is broken. It's predicated on student debt. A lot of the degree programs that are out there are not aligned with what workforce, and are not meeting the needs of students. And at the time, I took that all on myself. I'm like, we're failing students. We're not doing enough. We've got to do more. So I think the hardest part for me was feeling like we were not doing right by our most important constituency. Universities have become incredibly politicized atmospheres, and that's a tragedy. As we sit here today in the United States, 43 million Americans started college but dropped out. That's on us as leaders. And that was a really hard thing for me every day to go to work and think, we're not doing right by the people who are our constituents that we should be focused on.
That's the part people never see. It adds so much depth to the title. Leaders rarely talk about their lowest point. What was a moment where you questioned everything?
Many moments, but I think it was a little bit early on in my career, in my administrative career. I was a professor. I was a department chair at the time, and we lost not one but multiple students to suicide in a very short time period. And the first one was my student. She was one of my students. She was an anthropology student, and she was a really bright young woman. I just remember, she had been struggling. She felt like she didn't belong. The system was just grinding her out, like it was with so many students. They carry a lot of the weight of the guilt. College has become so expensive. Families are taking out second and third mortgages on their homes. Kids are sleeping in their cars because they can't afford it. They're sleeping in the parking lot at Taco Bell to get internet. I mean, this is not okay. And they're just carrying this guilt that their parents went through all that for them to be here. And now they're like, I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get a job. I don't know if I'm going to be able to pay back the money. And there's so much weighing on them. And this poor young woman, I watched her struggle and I watched her lose that struggle. That was unfortunately not the last, but that was the first posthumous degree that I was involved in. And over my career, there have been too many more.
Thank you so much for sharing that. You face public controversies, political pressures, and scrutiny for your research. What did those moments teach you about courage?
I think those moments taught me the importance of knowing your own values and sticking to them. Things will go up and down, but when you know that you're fighting for people whose voices don't get to be heard, when you know that you are fighting for justice, when you know that you see certain truths and you can't hide from them, I think that gives the courage. The other thing I learned is it's really important who you surround yourself with. As somebody once told me, you are an amalgamation of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And I thought that was really interesting. And it's those moments when you realize, oh gosh, like, am I going to rise to this challenge, or am I going to let it crush me? And so often the people around you are the ones who are going to help you remember who you are.
Hearing how you navigated that gives a lot of strength to people watching. How did you protect your well-being mentally, emotionally, physically when the pressure was at the peak?
I mean, to be honest, I didn't do a good job of it for a very long time. I was just trying to achieve, work, 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 work. At a certain point, I was a workaholic. I was just working nonstop. And I paid a very heavy price, my mental health did. And because I wasn't, for a very long time, I wasn't taking enough care of my mental health, and it caught up to me. It caught up to me in 2021. No, it kind of knocked on my door in 2014. And then I was like, no, I'm just going to keep achieving. I'm going to keep going. I'm, more, more, more. And then by 2021, I couldn't outrun my shadows anymore. And it was time to turn around and face them. And I did. And my life has been immeasurably better since then.
That's such a clear reminder that well-being isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. If you could go back and talk to your younger self before your first leadership role, what would you tell her?
Gosh, I would tell her it's not all on you. This is a system, and you're working your hardest, but it's not all on you. I would also tell her, stop being afraid, stop performing. I think we are taught often as leaders, like, just do whatever, say whatever to get along, get ahead. And especially, I think women who are, minorities in some way, we feel that pressure even more, like, to perform, to do or say whatever, not unethically, but just to, like, give of ourselves constantly and to just perform. And you often lose who you are in that process. So I guess I would say, remember who you are. Because I had done a pretty good job of it up until about 2011. And then as I started climbing the ranks of academic administration, that's when I started losing sight of who I was, really after 2011. And, it took about 10 years for me to realize that and then to come back to me.
That's such a heartfelt message. You can feel the wisdom in it. You have written 8 books, is that right? 8 so far?
Hmm. Hmm.
8 books. Which one changed you the most while writing it, and why?
Probably my latest book, actually. It's called Writing, the one that was most recently published. I've just finished writing 2 more books. They're both fiction. And those have also changed me because you want to talk about freedom. God, the freedom I feel in writing fiction is the best gift there is. But Writing is a book that came out early this year, and it changed me because it was so vulnerable. It was the book where I finally decided, let me take what I fear most about people finding out about me and put it on the page, and that is my weaknesses. I was so afraid of being vulnerable. I was so afraid. That book is all about falling. It's called Riding, and it's about how my riding horses influences my writing and how my writing influences my riding. But it's a meditation on failure and getting up. And it's I talk about my falls from the horses, these accidents that I had. But they're really also just metaphors for my failures. And for so much of my life, I'm like, I'm not a failure. I don't fail. I don't fail. People like me don't fail. And the whole book is about failing and getting up, which is in and of itself a success. So I think that book gave me the courage to be much more vulnerable on the page than I ever.
Thank you. So you mentioned your latest book, Writing, and also another book is Book of Queens. So you're talking and you're dealing in both books with horses and female. What actually drew you to these stories?
To me, ever since I was a little girl, horses have been the ultimate symbol of freedom. They are embodied freedom. That's what they are. You watch a horse gallop, you can't help but feel your heart just is like, I still, to this day, all these years later, I walk up to the barn where I ride here in Arizona, and I walk up and I watch them galloping and running, and my heart stops. It's just like, and they're so free to be who they are. They're just themselves. They're not trying to be anything other than themselves. And I've like always loved that. And that connection of human and animal connection has always been interesting to me. And then, when I started delving into the stories of horses in our ancestral culture, right? Horses in Persia, and the story of the horses in the Shahnameh, and, all of that. And, the horses that are carved into stone, and the Persepolis Takht Jamshid,
Right.
coming to learn that the Caspian horse is the oldest living breed of horse on earth, comes from our homeland. It's like a point of pride for me.
Wow. So what did you wrote about those horsewomen,
Hmm.
and what did they teach you about courage, about freedom?
Yeah, I think that the horses and the horsewomen, what they taught me was freedom at all costs. And freedom comes when you are your authentic self. Like when you are being your authentic self, these horsewomen were their authentic self. They were like, we don't care. We don't care what anybody thinks of us. We're going to do the right thing. We're going to fight in art for justice. We're going to do this. We're going to train. You don't have to work so hard for something that's yours. Freedom is ours. You just take it.
Definitely, I'll get back to freedom, because one of the main pillars of this podcast is freedom, and
Yeah.
everyone's definition of freedom is different, unique
Yeah.
to themselves. When readers close your books, what do you hope stays with them?
I hope that they ask themselves questions, because pursuing questions is much more fun than answers. The answers are, had a friend who always says to me, pursue questions, answers are transitory. And he's right. My hope is that when they close my books, they have a lot of questions that they, whether it's my Iran books, it makes them think about Iran differently, or whether it's, you know, my books where I'm putting my own identity out there in a vulnerable way, like I'm falling from horses and I'm failing, and I hope people makes them ask themselves, what's been a time when I've learned from my failure? Like, how does this apply to your life? I just hope it's a dialogue, because to me, growing up, books were like my best friends, because I didn't feel like I belonged, and I felt always a little bit awkward, and I was a nerdy kid growing up. And so my best friends were books, because I do feel when I'm reading it and I'm lost in a book, I feel like I'm having a conversation with an old friend. So my hope is that when people read my books, it's like talking to an old
Fantastic. That intention adds so much meaning to your work. It's powerful. So you have lived across intense environments, field research in the Persian Gulf region, academic leadership, public controversy. How have you protected your health through all of this?
I think it's really about maintaining a practice, a constant daily practice. And I think the first and most important shift that took place for me was realizing that our external world is a direct manifestation of our inner state. And so I had been constantly focused on my external world. Let me get a different house. Let me get a nicer car. Let me get my kids into private school, all these things. And realizing, why was I trying so hard to control the external state? Everything comes from in here. So if your inner state is a suffering state, you're going to be causing suffering to somebody, somehow, somewhere, no matter what. So the best thing you can do for this world is to work on your own inner state. And I realized I had to work on my own inner state, because I was not doing right by a lot of people I loved. And for me, that was about setting up and rigorously adhering to a practice. So I meditate every single morning at 6 a.m. for 30 minutes without fail. I do yoga or Pilates every single day, one or the other. Every single day, I move my body. I also interact with nature in the outer world. I either go on walks, hikes, I ride my horses. All of these things are important components to maintaining that calm, beautiful inner state. Meditation, that stillness, like letting the mind rest. Yoga, letting the body move in all these different ways, and then the connection to nature. All three of these are vital components. And it's not like, oh, well, I did it. I did a 7-day meditation or yoga retreat, I'm done. No, it's every single day. It's every single day. And I think keeping up that vigilance is the best contribution an individual. Like, my books all of that, it's nothing. It's nothing if I don't get my own inner state right. And I had to realize that. I had to come to that, that my greatest contribution in this world is my own inner state and how I can help others come to a better, more beautiful inner state.
It's so powerful. Thank you so much for sharing that. I believe it resonates with a lot of people out there. So, when you think about financial independence and other important aspects of our daily lives, so not wealth in a flashy sense, but stability, dignity, choice, what role has that played in your decisions?
I think that for a very long time, like I said, there's this pressure to achieve and have all sorts of abundance and status and all that. And then you realize that none of that is real. You realize that that's very much the world of the matrix. And you can either be a slave to it or you can step outside it and say, okay, I see that. And I'm going to make a different kind of contribution. So, I mean, I would say even from an early age, we're both Iranian. There's this like joke about when you're Iranian, you have three choices: doctor, lawyer, or engineer. And obviously, I clicked none of the above. And I went for a PhD in medical anthropology. I think my parents were like, what on earth? They got one MD. My brother's an eye doctor, eye surgeon. But my youngest brother is like me, a PhD. So I don't know, maybe they got one out of the three. No, my parents are actually very supportive at this stage. But I think back then they were like, what is she doing? You know. But like I said, I think I've always been driven by different questions. And I don't think I was driven by financial success. I was for a while seduced by status, which is, and it was both. I think two things can be true at the same time. I was seduced by my status, but I also really truly believed and still believe that my perspective actually positions me well to support students. And I know this. I know that I supported students. I know that my leadership was transformative for students. And I for over 25 years, I still to this day I get regular emails, texts, phone calls from students who are like, "You changed my life for the better." So I think two things can be true. I've always been driven by a desire for equity and access and justice. And I think there was a period of time where I got seduced by titles, but I very quickly realized I was out of alignment, and so I stepped away from that and have now been, spending my time trying to figure out how to help people access education, which is a right, not a luxury good. So, I think it's really important for us to gut check ourselves pretty frequently.
Yeah, I love that. Um, when you hear the word freedom today, after everything you've seen, what does it mean to you now?
Freedom to me means alignment with your higher self. Freedom to me means having the ability to be the fullest, most authentic expression of yourself, to move in the world on your own.
That definition to me feels earned. It comes from lived experience, not theory.
That's for sure true. Sometimes we have to go through the pain to have the realization. I don't know. I think like I said, I think when my soul came into this world, it checked the hard button. It was like, no, no, we're not going for an easy route. We're going to check the hard button.
I love it.
And yet, like, there's something to that, right? We learned so much. I really believe I have learned far more from my failures than I have my success.
Good. It takes me to the next question. It's interesting. How has your definition of success evolved from your 20s to now?
Yeah, great question. I think in my 20s, it was how many books can I publish? How the external validation, how many articles can I publish and this and that. And I think now today, my definition of success is how well am I in touch with my inner state? And am I being vigilant about not introjecting, right? That's that splatter where you take your own pain. They say that phrase, hurt people hurt people. How have I maintained my own inner state so that I'm not hurting people unwittingly sometimes? You don't know necessarily you're hurting somebody. And so I think that, yeah, I think my definition of success now is so much more about my inner state than the external world.
I love it. That evolution is Something a lot of people in our audience will feel connected to. What's one thing you had to unlearn to feel freer?
That is such a good question. I had to unlearn performance. I think that, when you grow up with these two cultures and all these things, you're constantly either code switching or maybe you're performing for somebody. You're like, what does this person want to hear? What, you know, and you're constantly trying to figure out what that other person wants and trying to be that thing. And then you lose yourself. So I had to unlearn performativity so that I could learn authenticity, because authenticity is the road to freedom.
So, unlearning is such an underrated skill. That's a powerful example. Thank you.
Yeah.
You have seen people living under repression, migration systems, strict gender laws. What has these taught you about human resilience?
That no matter what the circumstances are, people who are in alignment with themselves will find a way to break through and to break free. I was reminded of that recently. I live in Arizona and we have beautiful red rock landscape just north, in Sedona. And I was hiking with my kids and I saw this fern growing out of the side of these two rocks. Like these old rocks were there and this beautiful little fern was growing out. And it just reminded me, like, no matter what, the humans who want to grow and flourish in an authentic way, they will find a way.
Yeah, that gives such a deep look into what resilience really means. In all your research, what's one story you still think about years later?
Oh gosh, there's so many. Okay, because we are coming close to Christmas, I will share a story with you that I still think about. It was like a Christmas story in a sense. Um, I was studying and writing about a group of women from Madagascar, which is an African country. It's actually an island, beautiful country. But of course, when you say Madagascar, most people think of lions and lemurs,
Right.
the monkey, because of the cartoon. But what most people don't know is the levels of poverty are very, very high there. And a lot of women end up being trafficked because they need to make ends meet. They need to support their families. And so they make a very difficult decision between watching their kids starve and taking a risk and going. And so I was working with a group of women who had been trafficked and had either overstayed their visas or in whatever way had ended up imprisoned in the Gulf. With out of these 47 women, 17 had babies, and we took it upon ourselves, a group of us, in this anti-trafficking coalition I was with, that we were going to have to get these women home. And the 17 who had babies refused to leave the Gulf without their babies. But of course, the babies were stateless. And of course, Madagascar was like, well, I issue the citizenship passes through how. So we were so lucky. We convinced the South African embassy in the Gulf to issue white passports. They issued 17 white passports. And that one year, it was 2014, and we got all 47 women and their babies home to Madagascar for Christmas. And
Wow.
I still think about that.
That's the kind of a story that stays with you and now with us too. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you.
Wow. What has been your most unexpected teacher, someone or something that shaped you in a way that you didn't see coming?
My kids, without a doubt, my three children. I'm so blessed. I have three beautiful children. They challenge me and they teach me every single day. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't learn something from one of my kids. They are my greatest teachers and they're my greatest mirrors. Last night I was getting a little bit anxious about something and they said, well, have you done your grounding exercises, Mom? Did you not meditate today? But they hold me accountable, But they're each so different and they're so brilliant. And they've taught me far more about the world and about myself than I could ever imagine.
I cannot agree more. Those are the teachers that change us forever.
For
Beautifully
sure.
said. Thank you. So, what's the most powerful act of courage you've ever witnessed in your field work?
There's been so many. Uh,
I
I
bet.
think honestly, the women of Iran, I mean, it was every day, every single day that they went out there. with the hijab sliding back, with the red lipstick and the red nail polish. Every day, even after Neda, the Green Movement, even after Massa, I mean, like, even after all these things, there they were, still out there on the front lines protesting, even though their lives were at stake. That's a daily, it's just an incredible, incredible expression of courage. And then I think that, I would say the women, the women I worked with, the women migrants, the ones who said, I won't go home without my baby. I mean, that's a pretty, and they were willing to do anything. They were like, I will run, I will risk my life. If they shoot me, I don't care. That's a powerful act of courage.
Absolutely. I cannot agree more. This is beautiful. Beautiful example that we all know, we all have seen, we have experienced. We've been there, all of us. You
Yeah,
have
I
moved
think that's
into
right.
coaching, retreats, and Antheon. What inspired at this new chapter? When I was researching about Antheon, I really liked the definition of this word.
Yeah, the first time I heard the word, I was like, Entheon. What does that mean? And as a kid who's like bilingual, like, and I speak a lot of languages, but I'm like, anytime a word comes that I don't know and that I like the way it sounds in my mouth, I'm like, what does that mean? And then I learned the definition of the word. Entheon means the journey to find the creator within. I was like, that's been my whole life journey. And also helping other people find that, so it just resonated for me so much. And then, the retreats, it's a side business. It's a passion project. And it's really about holding space for people to explore their inner worlds and their outer worlds, to start to do some of that shadow work. That was so profound for me. I mean, had I not had the great fortune and the great blessing to be introduced and connected and reconnected. So I had done my PhD in medical anthropology, and I had focused on sexuality, but the area of shamanism and consciousness was a part of my discipline. And so I went back. It was that moment of desperation in 2021. I was so desperate. I was in so much pain, such a severe, severe depression. I went back to the shamanic realm, and I'm so fortunate that I was able to connect and reconnect with shamans from around the world who held the space and who gently and beautifully guided me back to myself. And that path was walking through my own shadows. It was not easy to do. And I will be forever, forever grateful to the people who held that space to carry me on that journey. And so to me, there's no greater honor than being able to hold space for people as they journey back to themselves, as they remember who they are.
I love it. You can feel how aligned this chapter is with who you have become. So how you mentioned your background in anthropology. How does it actually shape the way you guide people on their personal journey?
It's everything. To me, I'm like, is there anything better? You get to study people and culture, and you get to ask questions about why it is that people do the things they do. I'm like, and they'll pay me to do that. That's all I do anyway. I think it's a really beautiful field of inquiry because it's all about holding space for difference. It's all about holding space for exploration and curiosity. And I have often thought, education would be a better place if we approached education through the lens of expansion and curiosity rather than through the restrictive, critique and kind of curtailing. And so anthropology is, to me, it's so expansive. So, I feel that I have this great honor now to help bring some of the most, robust global thinking on how we think and how we meet ourselves, and what is the culture of me, and what are all these different cultures, and how are they swirling inside me, and what are the forests that I get to walk in and through, metaphorically and physically, to come back to who I am. And I wouldn't be able to hold that space if I didn't have all that theoretical knowledge.
I love it, so that connection makes so much sense. It brings such depth to your coaching. What's one pattern you see in people who feel stuck, and one way to break that pattern?
Honestly, one of the best ways is actually helping people to look at themselves in the mirror. It's really just helping people to take a moment. So I often say it sometimes the mirror is pressed too close to your face. You can't see it. You can't see yourself because the mirror is pushed up. And my job as a coach is just to gently guide that, like 6 inches out. That situation made me angry. What is the information there? Why did it make me angry? That information, that incident, excuse me, brought me great joy. Like, what are the moments in my day, in my week, in my month where I feel the most like myself? How can I find more of those? What are the moments where I feel the least like myself? And what has been the result? A question I ask people all the time because I have to ask it of myself. How many times has a decision that you have made from a suffering state turned out to be a good decision? Oftentimes, it's very rarely. I think about all the decisions I made from a suffering state, the wrong partners, the wrong relationships, the wrong jobs, the wrong projects. They were all made from a suffering state. It was fear or jealousy or guilt. Those are all suffering states. But when I made decisions out of a beautiful inner state, creativity, joy, engagement, connection, love, those typically were the better decisions.
Beautifully said. So that's something a lot of people in our audience will recognize instantly. Wonderful. If someone feels disconnected from themselves, their purpose, or their identity, where should they start?
I think they've already started. If they
Right.
already know, if you know that you are disconnected, you're already on the path. I always think the hardest situations are the people who have no idea. They're just going through their life, breaking things like, we call them young souls. They're young souls, but I meet so many people who are much older than me, but they're young souls. They're just going through life breaking things, and you're like, maybe I don't think you even know you're disconnected. So if somebody already knows they're disconnected, that's already the first step. And so you already know that the matrix exists. You already know that there's a mirror, that it's squished up against your face. Fantastic. So now that you know that you've already taken the first step, the next step is, okay, let's turn inwards and ask ourselves how we got.
Beautiful. Yeah, self-awareness is key. I love
Yeah.
that. So when everything is said and done, what kind of impact do you want your body of work to leave behind?
My hope is that it will help people feel seen. My hope is that my work will help people feel heard. My hope is that my work will help transformations take place at an accelerated pace. Whether it's transforming, helping people in Iran transform, the culture, if not the country, or it's transforming how we talk about trafficking, which I think, we really have, or transforming the education system. My hope is that my work will be a catalyst for change, that catalyst, though, is sparked from inside of people because it's coming from inside of me, too.
Such a meaningful vision. You can feel how much heart and intention you've poured into your work. I love it.
Thank you
So,
so
if
much.
this conversation helps even 1% rethink their identity or their freedom, what do you hope they walk away with?
My hope is that they walk away with knowing that they're not alone, that the fact that they're asking questions is placing them at the precipice of a great, beautiful, powerful transformation. And there are a whole lot of us who are waking up and are going from caterpillars to butterflies. So my hope is that they get to fly and that they come visit us at some point soon.
That's so powerful. Pardis, is there anything that you rarely talk about or you wanted to talk about it for a long time? This is the time.
Gosh, well, you've asked such great questions. I think one of the things I probably rarely talk about is my status as a mother, as a single mom. And because, we're taught that, we're successful women. Right now, I'm an entrepreneur. Like, you're not supposed to talk about your kids. But that's why I really thought it was important to mention that they're my greatest teachers. Because I do actually feel that my kids are such a huge part of my whole trajectory that I very rarely talk about. So many of the decisions I've made in my life have been for them. It's been about wanting to create a better world for them. Or, I've certainly made my share of mistakes. Oftentimes it was, I thought I was doing what was best for them. I always thought it was what was best for them, and for many years, like I said, I was operating out of a suffering state. And I think the thing that I've worked hardest on with getting myself into a beautiful state in the last 4 years is doing right by my children, because that's the part of me that very rarely people see. And that's one of the things that really drives my humanness, is feeling very, very strongly as a single mom that, I want to hold a really beautiful space for my kids to go through their own transformations, as opposed to imposing my framework on them. And so I've learned so much about myself, just not only from them, but I've learned about myself from being a parent and from my parenting failures. So, if anybody's listening to this and they're like, oh my gosh, I am, not doing the best job as a parent, I'm right there with you. And just give yourself some grace, because I think the fact that you're even aware of that, they say parenting is caught, not taught. I really do believe that. And I have seen a huge transformation in my children in the last 4 years. Ever since I started doing my own work, I've seen them change in huge and incredible ways. It has just been amazing. So I think the greatest gift we can give our children is doing our own work.
That's such a powerful note to end on. It captures the spirit of everything you've shared today. Pardis, your work shows how much wisdom lives in the places we don't always look. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much for having me on your show. I love what your podcast is about. I love the entire premise. I love what you're doing. And thank you for such thoughtful, beautiful questions. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And for everyone watching, if this conversation's opened something for you, share it with someone who needs it. Dive into Pardis books and keep exploring the stories behind the headlines. Till next time. Thank you.